Hey, good afternoon. I'm Mary Ann Hill. I'm the rector of St. Dunstan's. This is our deacon, Alan Barrow, and our seminarian, Omar Cisneros. And we thought it might be helpful for us to have a conversation around some of the things that are going on in our country right now, having to do with racial injustice. And we wanted to talk about it as church people. We wanted to talk about it out of our own experience, hopefully to help others think about how things affect them. And that's what we're here for today. There's a lot going on right now.
An awful lot going on. And as I was saying earlier, it's just witnessing all the events and the culmination of what's happened with Mr. Floyd is it touched me as in about my own prejudices and my own biases as I guess I could say as a recovering racist, and I'm dealing with myself and my God and my issues around that, and looking at much deeper into my own heart and my own thought processes. So yeah, this is it's been a challenging awakening of a couple of weeks actually for me.
You know, sometimes it's hard for people to talk about racism because when we talk about people who are racist, we think of Klan members and things like that, and it's hard to see, I think, sometimes how pervasive things are in our society, and that's why it can be helpful to talk about bias. Inherent bias or implicit bias is when it's those thought processes that happen without us knowing it, and the places our minds go, little mental shortcuts we make that take us someplace without us even realizing. A lot of the time it can be something that we don't even really agree with, but we've just been conditioned through various factors to think a certain way until we can challenge those ourselves. You know, it makes it hard sometimes for us to get beyond those things. Well, and the other thing too is, as church folks, when we talk about things like racism or being part of a system that is supporting racial injustice, I mean, as church folks, that ties into sin, and we don't like to talk about sin a lot, and it's really funny because I think in the Episcopal Church we don't. Well, we do. Alan and I like to talk. We like to talk about sin. We don't talk about sin that much, though, because I think in the Episcopal Church sometimes in the last 50 years it's sort of become something we didn't really want to keep doing, and we sort of got into an "I'm okay, you're okay" kind of.
Yeah, it's easy to do.
Yeah, we want to feel good. People want to feel good about God and church and stuff, but I think in my life, it's always better to deal with the things that are plaguing us and causing us to be less than the persons that God has created us to be, because when we don't address those things, they just kind of fester. So my friend, Matthew Gunter, Bishop Matthew Gunter, is the Bishop of Fond du Lac in Wisconsin, and he had put a post on Facebook last week and introduced a video clip from something on PBS about bias. And this is what Bishop Gunter said when he introduced us. He said, "I know not everyone likes the idea of sin, at least when it is applied too directly to themselves or those with whom they identify. Many find the idea that we are radically and profoundly broken at the core of our being an offensive notion. But I think there is hardly anything more self-evident. What the prophet Jeremiah said centuries ago remains true. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately corrupt. Who can understand it?" Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. This means, first of all, that we need grace and healing because we are not able to heal ourselves. But it also means that we need to do the hard work of making a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves and become as aware as we can of the movements of our hearts, and asking the Holy Spirit to guide us into all truth about ourselves so we can offer the good up for blessing and the not good up for repentance and change. There's a lot of good. A lot of good about our country, and there's a lot of not good.
Yeah, I like to call it honest critique. Honest critique is looking at all that which is healthy and wholesome, enabling and empowering, and all that which is destructive and separating and neglectful. So you look at both sides, you look at it in totality. And that way I find it, when I do that, even with myself, I don't get blinded. And I have people I talk to that help me see that spot in the back of my head that I can't see and point that out. They help me to understand and look at it from a different perspective. We were talking just a little earlier, that part of making a searching and fearless moral inventory. When I did my first, step 4 and step 5, one of the things that helped me really, really work at a deep level with that was my sponsor said that the whole idea of fearless is that no matter where you've been, what you've done, and how you've thought and behaved and carried on, whatever it all is, you can be fearless in admitting that and owning that because you are still loved and accepted as is. And there's you can't hide it anyway. And trying to hide it was part of my pain, was causing the pain that I carried and projected out to others.
And I think you said it right. I think taking inventory, I didn't know until recently, is a AA term for people to really kind of self-reflect on who they are.
Yeah.
And I think it takes a lot of courage to do that. And sometimes we may find ourselves not liking what we see, but we have to do it regardless. And I think specifically as Christians, we have to take that moral inventory very seriously and see how maybe our own actions are not in line with the gospel.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, and I think as much as we don't like to talk about sin sometimes in the church, people have a hard time understanding how much God loves them.
Yeah.
And that it's sort of like the net that's going to catch us when we do this moral inventory,
Right.
when we start thinking about, wow, what I'm really up to or what really goes on in my head or where I've been in my life. God's grace is there to catch us when we do the hard work of having to think about those things.
Yeah, and I think it's true for me that God used my sin to bring me to God. And it's counterintuitive, but when I stopped and thought about it over my life, that's pure genius. When you stop and think about it, that is just pure genius. And so that stuff that I had carried and done and I reflected upon and thought about and I went back over it, I had nowhere to go but to the one that can forgive. This Lord Jesus who can forgive me my sins, can raise me up to go beyond all of that. So I just find it I find it genius that God uses my own sins to bring me to God.
Right.
I had posted on Facebook last last Monday. It was something I called a confession, and but I talked about how this my own racism and my own bias is something I've been working on for well over 30 years. Interestingly, the person that first introduced me to really trying to think about this stuff is one of your professors.
Altagracia Perez Blord.
Yeah.
Perez Blord, yeah.
Yeah, she was when I knew her, she was a Province 5 youth coordinator and the youth coordinator for the Diocese of Chicago. And so it's kind of neat that Omar has her. Is she your advisor? Or
She is currently the director of contextual ministry.
Yeah. So, but Altagracia did a lot of work with us. I wasn't hearing about anybody else in the church doing it at the time, and then we had her come and do a youth program for the Diocese of Springfield. And it's not easy to have these conversations sometimes. But entering into that and then letting it work on me and marinating in it for, like I said, 30 years is a long time. It feels like a long time to be working on it, but I'm still working on it because Omar here helps me with stuff all the time. Things I don't even think about. And working with the Latino community, I've had a lot of eye-opening experiences about how I think about things, about cultural biases that I have, and just how things affect other people. I said in my post, Omar had tried to say something that happened to him, and I kind of thought, oh, well, maybe it's just his age. Maybe it's not because he's a Latino, but it was. And I didn't argue with him for very long because I knew that, I need to listen to what he's saying.
Yeah, and just speaking to that, I think it takes a lot of humility for when you belong to the dominant culture to kind of self-reflect and think about how you might just be completely oblivious to things that go on in other people's lives that may not affect you. I reflect on my own privilege in the sense that I am lucky enough to be a U.S. citizen, and that it itself has opened so many doors for me in ways that other people could have not, could potentially not do, including just being in ministry. The conversation changes when you are a U.S. citizen in my community.
Mm.
So
We I'm apologizing. My new puppy's in here on the floor, rattling his collar. Yeah, we thought we'd talk about bias today because it's a little bit easier to have that conversation, and it's something that affects all of us. When I was explaining earlier, this idea of implicit bias it has to do with the thought processes we have sometimes without our even realizing it, and when we think back about how we got to the places that we are where we have these things that pop up in our head. When I was a little kid, I lived in a community that was in a part of the country where there are a lot of African Americans, but we were really segregated. And it wasn't official segregation, but I lived up on the bluff, in a town up on the bluff on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, across from St. Louis, and in between was East St. Louis. And there was a kind of a notorious 60-minute special back in the, I don't know when it was, like in the 80s, early 80s, about that East St. Louis was the worst slum in the country. And it was, I don't know, I haven't been around there lately. I moved away from that part of the country a long time ago. But I was there one time doing some home repair work with some volunteers for some elderly folks who lived near where the Monsanto plants were. And the conditions that people were living in, I mean, I was appalled that anybody would live in conditions like that in our country. It was like a third world country. But when I was little, it was really interesting when I started thinking about this. When I was little, I don't think I became aware of race until maybe I was about 5 years old. And that was probably through television. I think Gordon on Sesame Street, or the police officer in Mr. Rogers. I'm going to date myself. I remember the Flip Wilson show.
Yeah.
no idea what that is.
No, you wouldn't. I was very, very young at the time. But the other thing I was aware of, it wasn't just what I saw on television. It was driving to St. Louis from where I lived, from the town where I lived. And we, at that time, you still went through East St. Louis, and it was a scary place. All kinds of boarded up and burnout buildings, and just it was just a horrible place. And I remember thinking, since all the African American people in my area seemed to live there, I didn't see anywhere I lived. I didn't even have an African American student in my class in school until I was a junior in high school.
Wow.
Until I was like 16 or 17. I know. But when I was little, I thought, well, all these people live in this terrible place. They must be bad people. I mean, I never voiced this to my parents because I would have been disabused of that notion immediately. But you know how when you're a little kid and you come to these conclusions, and you don't say anything to anybody, and people don't know that you're having these crazy thoughts. But I thought, well, okay, so all these people seem to live here, and this is a really bad place. Maybe they're bad people. And the first time that was challenged for me, and it wasn't challenged directly. It was just through an experience, because we get all these experiences through media, through news, through just living from what people tell us, and sometimes what people tell us verbally or what they tell us through their actions. So I was in a Burger King with my dad, and this was before, again, I'm dating myself, before drive-thrus were a thing. Drive-ins were a thing, but not drive-thrus. So we were in line. We'd gotten out of the car and went inside the Burger King, and we were in line. And there was an older African-American man in line in front of us, and it was a long line. And my dad started talking to him. And I thought, because I don't remember even seeing, anybody that I interacted with at all at that point who had been African-American. And we got our food, went back out to the car, and I said to my dad, Daddy, who was that man? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, why were you talking to him? And he said, because he was standing in line just like we were. And that was when I first started thinking, just like we were. Maybe he's just like we are. And that's when I started thinking, like, maybe it's not okay that all those people live in that horrible place. But that's sort of when it kind of, I realized, wait a minute, okay, all these things have been in my head, and then, but that experience of growing up near East St. Louis followed me for a long time in different ways. I mean, it created sometimes automatic fear in me that was irrational.
Right.
Because when we talk about bias, a lot of times these thoughts pop up in our head, and they're even things that we don't even really agree with, or maybe not even recognize are happening. But
yeah.
Anyway, I've talked a lot. I just did a long monologue there, but
no, it's fine. I think you brought up something that's very interesting. Is that we tend to forget that there's people within our own country that live under very difficult situations. I was watching the movie The Help the other day, and these Southern ladies are doing a benefit for children in Africa, and they, while at the same time, really supporting a very powerful, if you will, system of white supremacy in the South, where they, for example, if somebody died, they would will their maid to their family. This is after the abolition of slavery in this country. And so it's interesting that, especially, in the church sometimes, we're so focused on missions in other parts of the world, when sometimes, we could just drive 20 minutes down to a part of the city. But that usually is more difficult because it forces us to really reflect on our existence. That sometimes it's too close to home, and sometimes I think that's very difficult to do. But I hope through what's going on in this country, we're able to bridge some of those gaps in our communities, and really. And I'm not saying going to Jerusalem or going to a foreign country as a youth mission is a bad thing, but I think we could also really think about how we are not only doing something for other communities, but really trying to do something with other communities that are different from us. And it doesn't necessarily have to be around race, but it can be around economic status, and there's just immigration status. And so there's so much we can do, so much mission that we can do in our own communities that sometimes we decide not to do for a variety of reasons. And I think one of them is that it requires more ownership from us, and that's difficult sometimes for us to do, because it's hard. It's hard to have that agency, because church is safe. Church makes us feel good. We like being here. There's something comfortable about being in church, and so sometimes when we're challenged to look at things differently within our own community, it kind of breaks that safety that comes with belonging to a religious community. And so it's difficult. These are really difficult conversations that I think we're wrestling with. I live in a very challenging part of the city, and for me this is an everyday thing. For example, the over-policing of TPD is something that I see, and it's a fact, especially with Live PD being in the city. They were just stopping people left and right, hoping to make some TV happen. And I think But if you live in another part of the city, if you live where St. Dunstan's is located, maybe you're less likely to see that
Mm-hmm.
because that's not where Life PD is being filmed. Where Life PD is not being filmed in Tulsa Hills. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm still waiting for
Yeah.
the day Life PD stops a soccer mom or something, in a minivan or something, and so we just have to really reflect on these things and just be really honest and really just take a moral inventory, not only of ourselves but of our faith community and of our city. And we have profound history around race that is worthy to bring into conversation, and it's that richness, if you will, that we can learn from the past and hopefully not repeat the same mistakes or keep perpetuating that same mistake.
Absolutely. and it brings us into the humanity of us all. That's the beautiful part about
Right.
it. It helps me realize that we are all connected. We are all connected. And what happens in one part of the city affects people in the other parts of the city. That's just the way it is. It's a ripple effect of things. And then the other thing you're talking about too is not only my own moral inventory, if you will, but where I'm also complicit.
Right.
Where I just turned a blind eye or don't want to investigate because, the other people will take care of that. Somebody else will pull the fire alarm.
Right.
I don't have to do that. So
Mm-hmm.
looking at my own complicity is also a pretty strenuous thing to do.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult, and I think if anything good, I was listening to the George Floyd memorial service, and one of the things they kept alluding to was that his death was not in vain, and that his death had purpose. And I just reflect on that, and I hope that his purpose is that we're able to have these difficult conversations with ourselves and people who are not like us. We still have children in cages in the border. This is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I can say with enough empirical weight that I think that's wrong, and I think it's a sin. And I think it's also us taking a stand and just recognizing, no matter what political view we may have, there are things that are fundamentally against the gospel and against the ministry, that against who we are as Christians, and we can justify them, and we can believe them to be otherwise, and we can in that same way be very cruel about it. That doesn't make it right, and really have to ask ourselves, who are we lying to, right? Are we trying to, or who are we trying to convince? Are we trying to convince ourselves, or are we trying to convince other people that certain things in our society really need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed now, whether there's a COVID pandemic or not?
And in that regard, we need to bring different people to the table.
Right.
With different perspectives, and they need to be their stories need to be told, and they need to be listened to as well.
Right. Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just going to be the same old. I love that statement by was it Einstein? You can't fix a problem with the same consciousness that got you into it.
Right.
So you're going to have to change the voices. You're going to have to change the perspectives in order to move ahead with any of this.
Right.
But I'm like Mary Ann in that my racism was just insidious. I mean, I grew up in a white world. And so if it wasn't white, there was something wrong with it. There was something different. And because it was different, it was threatening to me. And there was just, the schools I went to, it was in Virginia and in North Carolina. Mainly in my formative years were in North Carolina around racism. But that's where I learned it. It just crept in. Hanging around with the kids I hung around with white kids. And so I would hear all the pejoratives all the time. And you want to fit in, you want to belong, okay. So that's how I went with the flow. because I was young. I had no real guidance in this stuff, and I just did. And then one afternoon, my father was preaching at a church, and he stood up and he told the people in the church, in the Methodist church, you'll either get into Klan or you'll get into church, but you're not going to get into both. You're not going to belong to both. And people stood up and walked out of the church, and they pointed their fingers at my brother and my sister and I and my mother, and they told us, you haven't heard the last of us. You haven't heard the last of us. And I lost my white friends. I lost my black friends because we were enemies, if you will. And the regional leader of the Klan lived a mile down the road on the same side of the highway. And between him and us, the parsonage was a tenant farmer. And they did corn and soybeans and some tobacco. And they were a black family. And once a month when the Klan had their rallies, they packed up everything they could in their truck and took off somewhere else. And I remember doing that. I remember those guys, those boys coming up and playing with us. They had a girl and two boys. They were about our age, about 11, and I think the other one was 9. I was a little bit older, but it fit my brother's age. But they would come up and play with us, and I was in the backyard one day, and tires screeched and squalled, and people were hollering obscenities at my brother playing with these guys in the front yard, and my father kicked the door open, and the screen door open, and he was in the Marine Corps, and he leveled an M1 Garand at him, and the car took off, but I started learning the whole conundrum. I mean, it was just a boiling pot for me that I never could really figure out. But, and I stayed a pretty flagrant racist until the table was turned. And I moved to Hawaii. And I was a white person in the minority. And then I understood. The fear, the trauma that causes. The alienation. And the need I had to just center myself around other people that looked like me just for protection. Just so that if something blew up, we would cover one another's back. I mean, we were called Howleys, white people. The last day in school, the school I went to in Waipahu was called Kill Howley Day. And if you went to school to do your exams on the last day, bad things could happen. And it was just a real mixture of things for me. And that's what I think when I lived in Hawaii, that's what kind of turned my whole thinking around. I had to look at things a little bit differently because I was on the butt end of it. And I was only there for 18 months. And in 18 months, I was filled with hate and rage against Asians and Orientals and Polynesian cultural people. I just hated them, And that was just 18 months. And we lived in a fairly, we had military housing, so we had good stuff. We had good stuff to live in, but couldn't get a job. Going to school was a nightmare. There were 19 of us in a school of 2,200, 19 white, and it was always trouble. It was always trouble, and I just learned to hate, and I hated deeply, and to the point of causing severe bodily harm to people. And it's a tough thing. But I want to close my little story with the people that helped me break my whole notion of some kind of sense of racism, having racism towards people, were black men in prison. Programs I did with them and working with them and listening to them and their stories and stuff like that. And listening to their stories, I learned, oh my gosh, I can't believe you are doing as well as you are. But these guys kind of ushered me through that, and unbeknownst to me, I didn't realize it till I looked back on it. So, I mean, I give a lot of credit to incarcerated black men, the programs I took in the groups, and with Native Americans and some Latinos. These people helped me to realize how so much alike we really are, and how much we really need one another if we're really going to make this world a better place.
Yeah, I think listening. I think for me, even as a Latino, it's important for me to even listen and see what I can learn from people who have walked a different life than me. I think for me, sharing my own story around, implicit bias. I had a boss who ran a nonprofit who who would speak to me like what he thought a cholo spoke to, and he did that a lot, just about every day, and he thought it was funny, and I don't think he realized how deeply offensive it was to somebody like me. And so one day I just kind of walked up and said, hey man, just to be honest with you, I've practically grown up in the suburbs my whole life, and so I don't even really know what cholo culture is. Not that I had not been around cholo culture, or that I had some friends that were like, kind of in that lifestyle at one point, but I've never would see myself as a cholo, if you will. And so it was just really irritating that people, when they look at you, would make certain assumptions about a way that they feel that they could talk to you in a way that was so disrespectful. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, reflecting on my own, whiteness, and having the capacity to pass as a white person has been very revealing to me, if you will. Because of what white people have said to me at certain points in my life, where they assumed I was white, and they would make little comments about. One time they made comments about Mexican people. One time I caught some people making a comment about. It was at Tulsa Public Schools. We had a Latino family come in, and they were asking for directions, and the security guard at the table helped them out. And then as soon as they left, it was a female security guard having a conversation with the janitor and saying something like, you think they'd learn the language, and we just standing there going like, having a moment of going like, did they just say that in front of me? And just like having to be in those situations where realizing that you're exposed to things that you may not have been exposed before, but also just really come to terms that certain people find me in a way like less threatening because of my skin color, because I'm not I don't look the part, if you will, and just constantly being asked if I was half white, when if you've been around Latinos, there's a variety of different ethnicities and makeups in Latin America, including Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Peruvians, Afro-Mexicans, and so it's very easy for ourselves to kind of fall into these categories, and when there is a whole breadth of diversity within just the Latino experience. That being said, I think it's just reflecting on my own privilege and saying, how can I be a voice for those who don't look like me. For me, just recently I was at a music store with Father Alberto, who's the priest at Holy Spirit, Espiritu Santo in East Tulsa, and just really seeing how people treated him, who spoke broken English, and who obviously looks Latino, and just really even like knowing that people make assumptions about you and treat you a certain way because of your skin color, still being taken back by how people were talking to him and how people wouldn't give him the time of day. And this was at a music store, and so I just really was, believe it or not, kind of caught off guard again, just forgetting, right, that people make assumptions about you based on how you look. Mm-hmm. And he was wearing a clerical collar, and
oh my gosh,
and people didn't really care. I mean, they were just not we're just not given the time of day until, for example, I intervened at one point and said, are you going to help us or not, or do we have to take our money somewhere else? And then this is when, this is today. This is within our own country, and so for a lot of people, your status as a clergy person does not earn you the societal respect it should. Not that, I am sitting with two clergy people, but not that clergy want to be treated differently, but and so it's difficult. But we have to really take this head on, and really have these conversations in order for us to deconstruct our our own implicit biases.
I was involved in Kairos prison ministry for many, many years, and we had a gentleman on our team quite often, and his name was Laren West. And in the morning, we would always gather around for people who were going to talk, give talks, and other chapel services, maybe meditations. And Laren offered that prayer one morning before we all left to go to the prison. And he ended his prayer with this comment. He said, "Oh Lord, may you remember that where we are going and the people and the men that we're going to see, they belong to you. And we don't want to do anything that will mess up your property." I'll remember that prayer. Yeah.
I also reflect our own tradition in the sense that I'm always taken back when I go to, Episcopal churches, that there's a white Jesus, hanging on the wall, and it just catches me off guard that we just assume that Jesus was white in a way, even though we know better. And I think it's very fascinating that we have these beautiful European-looking Jesuses all across the church. And there's a church in Chicago that the neighborhood was changing, and it was becoming more of a mixed neighborhood between Anglos and African Americans. So what they did is that they remodeled the church, and they painted the Jesus. They made him a little darker. So I just
made him look like somebody from Palestine.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I'm just praying that this struggle has been going on for so long, and it feels like sometimes we take a step forward we take one step forward and 5 steps back, and I'm hoping that we finally reached a point, and I'm hopeful with your generation. Yes. That we've reached a point where, and Chaz, who's sitting on the other side of the camera there, where you all are going to pull us in the right direction. Maybe some of us kicking and screaming, and maybe others glad to go there. I mean, I know it's easy for us to get distracted by looting and rioting and stuff like that, and take our eye off the ball of the important work in social justice and racial justice that needs to happen. And the things that need to change, the systems in our country that need to change, because this is a wonderful country, but it's just like the lives that God gives us. We have to keep living into that and keep trying to move forward and be the people that we're being called to be, and to really live into our ideals so that everyone can live into that future together. So you guys, we're counting on you. Not that we don't have work to do too, but to keep our feet to the fire, hopefully. And we, I think we'll probably have some more conversations.
Sure.
Do y'all have anything else that you want to add at this time?
No. You said about the looting and the burning and the destruction that goes on. There's a time in my life where I understand that rage. I understand that rage. of hopelessness and helplessness, and being stuck in a place where you feel like you have nothing to do, there's no way to express yourself, your voice isn't going to be heard, and so you just go completely crazy. I understand that. I've been there. I've done that. I don't say it's okay. I'm not condoning it, but I am saying I do understand that kind of rage. I do.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you know, along those lines, see, there are a lot of red herrings out there. I had a friend of mine. I've seen a couple of people post things on Facebook about, well, this thing with George Floyd, but what about these people over here? I just saw one this morning, and it was about some person who'd been a white person killed in some kind of bigotry or prejudice laden crime, and they weren't killed by a police officer. They were killed by a criminal, and it's not justice isn't a pie. It's
Right.
not a pie. It's not like if I have a piece of this pie, there's not going to be any pie for you.
Right.
There's enough pie for everybody to
Right.
go around if we all keep focusing on that. We need to make sure that we're all part of this world and this country together, and we're all God's beloved children. And but yeah, there are a lot of red herrings right now out there,
True.
and things that will distract us from the important work that we need to do.
Yeah, I couldn't. That was so well said. And I would just say, I think the best thing you can do is inform yourself. There's a lot of great books out there, excuse me, that help you make an informed decision. That because part of this journey is to take ourselves out of our own, kind of our own experience and our own way of viewing the world and trying to understand how other people understand the world. And I think that's interesting that we try to do that every Sunday when we read the gospel and we read the lessons. We try to understand Christianity from the perspective of the Apostle Paul or the Old Testament. And I think it just takes that kind of dedication to modern issues of race and poverty, because I think they're all interconnected, and policing in order for us to come to a better, more knowledgeable conclusion.
Yeah.
And not just go off gut feelings on these things, because that's the problem. I think we think we know the answers to things that are deeply complicated and require deep wrestling and reflection.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you guys.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. I hope you all have found this conversation helpful. If you have questions or you want to hear about some other things, let us know. Like I said, we may do some more like this. We'll have to see how this goes. I want to thank Chaz Emerson, who's sitting on the other side of the camera with his headphones on and his computer, and he's got this fancy microphone. And we've come a long way, baby, since March 7th or whatever it was that we first did our first live stream with phones. So we're really deeply appreciative to Chaz. So anyway, God bless everyone, and God bless our country and everyone in it. Everyone in it.
Amen.